Divine command theory is the topic of today's lesson. And now that we have this view available to us, we can actually think a little more deeply about what moral properties are. So I want to do something in this video. I want to go ahead and first make sure that it's very clear what divine command theory entails, and then we'll reflect a little bit on moral properties. As a refresher, divine command theory typically entails the following theses. God is the source of moral law. What God forbids is morally wrong. What God allows is morally permissible. The very meaning of moral is given by God's commands. So clearly there's an element of the supernatural going on here. But sometimes people don't quite understand how direct the relationship is between God and morality in this theory. So I'll try to make this a little clearer by, first of all, I'll give you a poster child for this view. William of Ockham believed in divine command theory, and of course he's famous for shaving off extra beliefs. It really is the case that there is a direct connection, according to this view, between God and morality. So to kind of make that really clear, I'm going to go over now an ancient debate, and hopefully that will get you to see a little clearer what's going on here. So we're speaking, of course, of the Euthyphro dilemma. By the way, I've also heard British people pronounce it Euthyphro. In any case, it is an early dialogue by Plato, and characteristically, one of the characters is Socrates. Plato almost always has Socrates as a character. Of course, we don't know that this is what Socrates actually thought. Usually, we take Socrates as a stand-in for Plato himself. So whenever you see Socrates, you can more or less assume that that's what Plato is thinking. And it's always Socrates, or almost always Socrates, debating some other important figure in Greece. So let's kind of cut to the chase here of the Euthyphro dilemma. There's a whole lot of setup and build-up, but none of it's really relevant or essential. In the end, it came down to this. Now here is a picture of Plato. Again, we'll consider Plato and Socrates basically the same person. In the end, and in monotheistic terms, Socrates asks, is what is morally good commanded by God because it is morally good, or is it morally good because it is commanded by God? So, sure, we've made these questions into monotheistic terms because, of course, in Greece they spoke of gods. But this is the general gist of the problem. And, it really does set up this dilemma, which I've kind of crudely placed into the following terms. Now, obviously, this is my own wording, but it really does get to the point. Either morality exists independent of God, and He commands us to obey the moral law, or God simply invented morality. So, in option A, morality kind of is its own thing, if you want to think about karma or something existing independent of God, and God recognizes that it is a good thing, and so He tells you to obey it. That's one possibility. But of course, there is a much simpler possibility. Instead of believing in two things, you only believe in one. God is the only thing that existed, and He invented morality. So obviously, option B is what William of Ockham would go with, and that is in fact what divine command theorists go with. It is the view that God stipulated or invented, or whatever other word you want to say, directly arbitrated morality. God is the sole source of morality. So this is a little counterintuitive, and in the rest of the lesson you kind of see some problems with this, but for now I actually want to give you some support for this view. So perhaps the best support I can give is the following. 1. Moral properties, for example, moral wrongness, somehow have not to be doneness built into them, and DCT seems to be able to explain this. So let's take a look at an example here so you can kind of see what's going on. Let's assume here this little boy is, I don't know, Jimmy. And what someone might say when they look at this scenario is they might think to themselves, yeah, Jimmy didn't really think stealing is wrong. Because part of the idea behind the belief stealing is wrong is that if something is wrong, you just don't do it. So clearly here, Timmy is either making an exception for himself, maybe he believes that stealing is wrong in general, but not for him, or at least not in this particular case. Or maybe he just doesn't believe it at all. But the fact is, if someone really thinks something is wrong, they won't do it. And that's, sort of this approach to morality. Wrongness, moral wrongness, the concept of moral wrongness has, you're not allowed to do it, built into it. Now, it's kind of hard to say that in any one word, so we usually put a bunch of hyphens connecting all those words together, not to be doneness. In any case, that's the idea behind the divine command theorist, and that does make sense. When you think of morally wrong things, it does include don't do it. And what could possibly account for that other than a supernatural being told you not to do it? Along these same lines, this is fascinating. Even prominent moral skeptics / atheists like Joyce believe there is something right about DCT. In other words, that it accurately captures what's distinctive about moral properties. So Richard Joyce does not believe that morality is objective, and he also doesn't believe in God. But he says there is a connection there. It seems like we invented both concepts, says Joyce. Of course, he's an atheist, so he believes we invented the idea of God. And he's also a moral skeptic, which means we invented the idea of morality. And he says, but he thinks they were invented around the same time. So, very interesting idea here. Even an atheist backs up something like DCT, although maybe we would call it the atheist version. So this opens up a room for a new conversation. And it all centers around the question of what moral properties are. So when you think about moral wrongness, what are you really thinking about? And so these are some possible positions on what moral properties are. Let me begin with one that we've already covered. So last time we covered two ethical theories, ethical egoism and social contract theory. And both of them assume psychological egoism. Interestingly, they both also assume, at least in pretty popular versions of these theories, something called hedonism. It's the view that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. So what is interesting about that is that pleasure is itself a natural property. So we can call this moral naturalism. It's the view that moral properties are some type of physical or natural object. For example, good just is pleasure. Now, there is what good might look like to a moral naturalist, although it could take other forms, of course. There are many neurotransmitters that produce pleasure. But the general idea here is, think about any moral property, and you can find some natural object, some physical object, ultimately, that actually is what it is, that equates to it. So this is definitely a controversial view. We've already covered some problems with this view. It's not clear that it's true, but it is a perspective on what moral properties are. So here's another one. Moral non-naturalism. So non-naturalism just means that it includes anything that's not natural. So it's both the supernatural and anything else you can think of that isn't natural. It's the view that moral propositions and properties are not expressible in non-moral terms, and cannot be equated with natural properties like pleasure. So we have a very famous non-naturalist here. I'll give you a quote by G.E. Moore. If I am asked what is good, my answer is that good is good, and that is the end of the matter. Or if I am asked how is good to be defined, my answer is that it cannot be defined, and that is all I have to say about it. So that's from his Principia Ethica. And so here, G.E. Moore is essentially saying you can't do this whole equating goodness with pleasure. It just doesn't work that way. It doesn't capture the true, pleasure doesn't capture the true essence of moral goodness. And so, just like G.E. Moore believes that moral properties are non-natural, that's exactly what the divine command theorists are saying. Divine command theorists are saying moral properties exist via commands by God. And if it's a command by a supernatural being, guess what? That is definitely not natural. You can't find some neurotransmitter that equates to, a command from a divine being. So it is a non-natural view of moral properties. So maybe this will help to understand, again, the case of Jimmy. Let's just say we're trying to explain to Jimmy why stealing is morally wrong. And let's first take the naturalist tact. We say to Jimmy, hey, you know why you shouldn't steal? Because it's not in your best interest. I'm not sure that Jimmy would be convinced by that. He'd say, what are you talking about? This is absolutely in my best interest. I need this tractor now. What if you were to say to him something like, it won't maximize happiness for everyone involved? What if you make it really natural like that? You talk about pleasure and happiness. It won't be the action that makes the most amount of people happy. I'm not sure that Timmy, or was it Timmy or Jimmy? Whatever. I'm not sure that he would care. So you're telling me not to do this because it wouldn't maximize happiness? That doesn't make me feel like not doing it. And then we say, well, you shouldn't steal because a supernatural being who can do anything told you not to. That now gets people usually thinking a little more. As long as you believe in supernatural beings, you'll think, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this then. In fact, throughout most cultures, apparently this is a cross-cultural phenomenon, parents often sort of get their children to behave in certain ways by telling them that some supernatural thing will harm them if they don't. So I'm from the Mexican culture, so we have our stories on some supernatural beings who, if you're a naughty boy or girl, they'll come after you. But this is, as far as I've heard, across every imaginable culture. I know there's a really interesting Filipino horse person who goes after naughty kids. So this is a pretty common way to get people to not do things. This is a clear connection now between good behavior and supernatural beings. And that's why maybe the divine command theorists are onto something. So let me summarize everything I've said so far in the following way. There are some things that seem like they shouldn't be done, and saying they don't maximize pleasure doesn't seem like a good enough explanation for why this is so. If an action has not to be doneness built into it, it doesn't seem like anything can account for this other than supernatural beings who imbue moral properties into some actions. Basically, if you believe something really shouldn't be done, it just seems like the best explanation for why that makes you feel that way is that a supernatural being told you not to do it. Just like when you were a little kid. So, to kind of close, I want to give you a nice long quote from one of these atheists who believes that divine command theory is actually onto something. And then I'll give you a little bit more support for this view. So, here we go. As an atheist, I don't believe that anything is literally sacred. Yet I don't suppose I could do an especially good job of articulating precisely what it means for something to be sacred. So here, this is Richard Joyce, by the way, here Joyce is saying essentially what G.E. Moore said about goodness. You can't really define sacred, just say you can't really define good. That, if they're both supernatural, this would make sense, because you just simply can't reduce the supernatural to the natural. Let me continue. That said, of course, the atheist needs to have some idea of the content of these religious concepts, or else he could not object to someone who tries to reassure him that sacred means nothing more than salubrious, which just means healthy, that God just means love, and that heaven is a word that denotes Tahiti. And how could one reasonably doubt the existence of salubrity, love, and Tahiti? So what Joyce is warning against here is some kind of verbal jujitsu, right? When you're trying to define a supernatural thing, like God, and some people sneak in a natural property like love. And he's saying that's not fair. First of all, love does not actually capture everything that God means. And if anyone tries to say that it does, they're pulling some jujitsu move on you, some philosophical jujitsu. Same thing with heaven. Oh, heaven is just like Tahiti. No, that's not what heaven is like. So you can't confuse a non-natural or supernatural concept like sacred or God or heaven with some natural thing like being healthy. That's what salubrious means, or love, or Tahiti. So with that said, Joyce moves on to discussing morality. In a similar way, when faced with a moral naturalist who proposes to identify moral properties with some kind of innocuous naturalistic property, the maximization of happiness, say, the error theorist, which is Joyce's position, will likely object that this property lacks the kind of normative umph that permeates our moral discourse. So that last part is the most important part. Normative umph. When we say that you shouldn't do something, we really mean you shouldn't do it. And to tell you, hey, you shouldn't do that because it won't maximize happiness, that usually won't do the trick. You know what will do the trick? Telling you, hey, a supernatural being told you to not do that. This can go really bad if you do this thing that you were told not to do. Don't do it. That is normative umph. That makes you feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this. So only a non-natural thing, property, can explain why you feel like not doing things that are morally wrong. So in the lesson itself, I did give you some research that links basically big complex societies to the existence of gods. So let me just clarify this real quick. Ara Norenzayan is the person who advocates this theory. Now, Norenzayan is an atheist, so he also believes that gods, all the gods, were invented at some point. So with that said, let me read here from the slides. Some researchers go further, arguing that humans, with their ability to construct social realities through cultural evolution, eventually stumbled on the idea of big, powerful, supernatural deities that were morally concerned. So first of all, he just says this was an accident. It was through cultural evolution. Eventually, we just got this idea of big, powerful gods who care about what you do. Let me continue from the slides here. These thinkers claim, and I'm talking here about Norenzayan, that big gods were a necessary element in what enabled society to scale up to the present level of complexity. So in our current society, we have an extreme degree of complexity, a very, very pronounced division of labor. I mean, some people never make a single essential thing in their life, right? They never make food. They never grow their own food. They never make their own clothes. And those were, 2,000 years ago, you needed to do those things. So our current society is extremely complex, and it all has to do with division of labor, which means everyone does what they're supposed to do, what they ought to do. So what Nor and Zion is doing here is sort of linking the idea of big gods with being pro-social. I mean, having this degree of complexity in society requires that we are all pro-social and we kind of stick to our roles and do that kind of thing. So Nor and Zion here is really making a case and providing a ton of evidence, if you want to take a look at this book, as to how religion, in particular big gods, the big monotheistic gods, really made us way more cooperative, substantially more cooperative. And cooperation is just a, shall we say, a hop, skip, and a jump away from being moral towards each other. So there's a connection that I wanted to make. And if this is true, this is really good data that supports the view, even though it's an atheistic perspective, that the invention of gods did make us more cooperative. And so perhaps there is something right about divine command theory.